Welcome to this edition of Psychedelic Radio. I'm Christina Thomas, the president and founder of Myself Wellness, and my co-host is Charles Patti. Together, we co-founded the Warriors of Consciousness, a not-for-profit to help people gain access to psychedelic ketamine therapy. Together, we are on a mission to help save and transform lives through this treatment. In this podcast, we'll be pushing boundaries, breaking taboos, and shedding light on the use of psychedelic medicines. We want to share expert knowledge and firsthand accounts of those who have experienced transformative psychic shifts using psychedelics. Journeying with us today is Albert Garcia-Romeu, Ph.D., and is a member of the Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences faculty of Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He is also a guest researcher on the National Institute on Drug Abuse and Intramural Neuroimaging Research Branch. His research examines the effects of psychedelics in humans with a focus on psilocybin as an aid to as a treatment of addiction. He has received his doctorate in psychology in 2012 from the Sophia University of Palo Alto, California, where he studied self-transcendence and meditation and their relationship to mental health. His current research interests include clinical application of psychedelics, mindfulness, and altered states of consciousness, and their underlying neurobiological mechanisms, real-world drug use patterns, and the impact on public health, the role of spirituality in mental health and addiction, and the qualitative mixed methodologies toward investigating these areas. It's so great to have you, and it's so wonderful to see you again, Al. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's nice to see you again. I know we had a chance to talk a little bit in person at the Cannabis conference earlier this year in Miami, but it's nice to reconnect here and be able to chat some more.
Yeah, definitely.
Most definitely. For everybody listening, we actually met Al out in Miami, and we listened to him speak at Cannabis, and boy, there was some fascinating things that were getting said about what's happening with these psychedelic compounds for substance abuse issues and addictive behaviors and a whole gambit of other things. And so this is really an exciting time to be alive, to say the least.
I would agree 100%. I would just say, when I was growing up in Miami and when I was going to high school, I mean, that was around, the late 90s. Never would have thought, honestly, that we would be where we're at now, just like 20 or so years later, where we're getting some real momentum towards mainstream, acceptance of psychedelics as medical treatments. So it's pretty exciting. You're right.
Beautiful. So I guess, I got to hear some amazing things in Miami, but I guess I would love to just touch on some of the research that you're doing and what you guys are finding at the university.
Yeah, so I've been working here at Johns Hopkins for about 10 years, and we've been, working with psilocybin primarily in that time. And the field has grown, by leaps and bounds in that time. The kind of job offer that I got, I was a postdoctoral fellow when I finished my Ph.D., was pretty much to come on and work with Matt Johnson and Roland Griffiths and Mary Casamano and all of the team here. And specifically, Matt Johnson had come up with this small pilot study, as we call it. These are kind of like these very early stage studies where we just kind of want to see if, this makes sense to study in more depth. And so you just start off with a really small, scale type of study. And that one was for cigarette smokers who want to quit. I mean, I think we all know cigarette smoking obviously is not good for your health, but I think oftentimes the public health impact is just not really, in terms of the scale of that is not really well understood by a lot of folks. Specifically, we talk about the opioid epidemic. I mean, we're actually currently at what is the highest level of opioid overdose deaths in the U.S. in history. But that's still under 100,000 deaths per year. Whereas with cigarette smoking, we have about 500,000 deaths per year related to tobacco. And so it's a really big problem, obviously. It's also extremely hard to stop smoking. We have a few treatments that work, like nicotine patches and, some medicines that help some people. But that initial pilot study that we did with cigarette smokers, we found a lot of success with 2 or 3 high doses of psilocybin, combine it with cognitive behavioral therapy, and, found that majority of those people quit, and then they stayed quit for the long term, which is really exciting. And that kind of led into basically what I've been doing here ever since. We've developed a much larger study. We're actually just finishing a big study in 82 people, where we either randomly gave them psilocybin or nicotine patches, and then we are going to compare, who quit smoking between the groups to see which treatment seems to work better. And so far, it seems like the psilocybin continues to work, at a higher rate than even this accepted FDA-approved treatment with nicotine patches. So, that's been, something that I've been focusing on for a while now, specifically working with Matt Johnson on that project.
I love, pardon me, I love it. And, this actually really hits home for me because, first of all, my father actually passed away from lung cancer when I was really young. And so he died from smoking cigarettes. And then I actually, unfortunately, and I don't know why, but it just happened, I started smoking cigarettes at a very young age. I actually started smoking cigarettes around 11 years old.
Yeah.
And I quit smoking cigarettes through psychedelic use. It was through different psychedelic compounds, psilocybin being one of them, that I actually quit smoking cigarettes. And I think one of the not only did it took the urges away from me as much, but one thing I always tell people is that psychedelic medicines gave me the ability to actually love myself enough to actually want to start living a healthier lifestyle. I couldn't stand myself for a long time. And it was through that I quit smoking. I started eating healthier. I started exercising and really taking, those steps forward in my life to live a healthier, more fulfilling life.
Yeah, no, and that's what your research really entails too, is not only, right, the use of psychedelics, but the use of these mindfulness practices as well.
And I love that. I love what you're doing. I really do. I have so much respect for you. Thank you so much for your service to humanity, and also to talk about all of the other things that are the recipe for long-term success with these healing modalities.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just congratulations on quitting, because it's, a great thing for you to be able to do for your health. But, I 100% agree with what you're saying there, which is, it wasn't just about stopping smoking. It wasn't just about reducing the craving to do it. But there's often, this whole other layer beneath that, which, we're using these substances, and it doesn't even have to be drugs or substances. It can be sex. It can be shopping. It can be also work. People can really find a lot of different ways to kind of get away from themselves or to avoid underlying issues that they don't want to look at. And I think ultimately a lot of it comes back to what you said, which is, taking a long, hard look at yourself and saying, hey, this person is a good person. They're a person that's worthy of love and being loved. And I'm going to give myself that. And when you start to give yourself that, then that also comes along with a lot of other benefits, like, hey, I'm not going to engage in these self-destructive behaviors anymore. I'm going to find other ways to engage that are healthier and, better for my well-being long-term.
No, I love it. I love it. A question that I really have for you that I'm interested in, and I heard you touch on it when you spoke, but there's a lot of back and forth about what's more effective when treating these kind of things.
Stole my question.
I'm sorry, but what's more effective when it comes to treating these things? You hear about microdosing, and you hear about more like therapeutic doses and macro doses. And has the research that you guys have done really point in a direction of what we're getting better results long term for helping people with?
Yeah, no, that's an important question that we get asked a lot, and I have to say, unfortunately, we're still kind of in our nascent, kind of very young stage of psychedelic medicine research. We are too early, I would say, to be able to give people a good answer. And people ask me all the time because, say, my son has a problem with opioids, or my friend is really struggling with alcohol. Is there a specific psychedelic treatment that will be better for them, ketamine or psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca? And, we really can't say. I mean, we can say with some, and actually Dr. Michael Bogenschuss just published his study, I think last week, looking at psilocybin assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder and showing that, the psilocybin treatment, people were getting more benefit than the placebo group. So that's really, a positive finding. But, has that been tested head to head versus something like LSD or ayahuasca or mescaline or some other type of treatment? No, not really. I mean, we can't come back and look at numbers and say, oh yeah, we know that this drug would be a better treatment for this type of addiction or condition. I mean, so I think in the early days where we have a lot more interesting things to study and look at all these other chemicals and also other types of talk therapies or, behavioral therapies that we can incorporate to figure out which works best. And ultimately, I think there will be some sort of ability to say, we know this person has a history of, this type of problem or this type of mental health condition. And based on that, we think this type of drug and this type of behavioral therapy will be best for them. But yeah, today, I mean, it's really a lot of guesswork. And, part of that has just been, we haven't been able to do enough research. Even drugs like LSD, which were studied a lot in the 1960s, have not been studied, in the United States recently because of all the stigma and also the regulatory hurdles, man, to be able to get your hands on legitimate, LSD that the FDA has approved for you to give to humans is really challenging and it's expensive and it takes a long time. So I think maybe in 10 years we'll know more. But for now, we can definitely say one thing, going back to your earlier question, Charles, which is, most of the treatments that we've seen work, particularly in treating, substance use disorders, but also for treating major depression, for instance, those have been using high doses. So, people talk a lot about microdosing, but there haven't been good definitive placebo-controlled studies that have shown that when you're using microdoses of any of these psychedelics, that they're creating any long-term benefit. However, we can say pretty, definitively now that with something like high-dose psilocybin, you're getting, in a placebo-controlled trial, double-blind, you're getting people who are improving better from their alcohol use disorder with the high-dose psilocybin. And same with our smokers that we haven't published those data yet. And, in studies looking at psilocybin for depression, all of those have used high doses and not a lot of high doses, usually one or two, seems to be good enough, to help a lot of people have benefit.
Amazing. So today it's actually very synchronistic that we are talking to you today. Today is actually International Overdose Awareness Day. And so I want to talk to you a little bit because this, especially in our lives, has hit really close to home lately. I mean, there's just so many people every day. I feel like we're hearing somebody that Charles knows, has unfortunately overdosed. And there's this huge just fentanyl epidemic going on around us. And so what is your research clinically showing for addiction, especially opioid addiction and the use of psychedelics?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have found ourselves in a kind of a dark time, both, with that surging opioid epidemic, with, fentanyl just kind of really being prevalent all over the U.S. now, in, the different opioid markets. And as a result, there's a lot of huge health problems. I think a lot of people are turning to opioids just because things are so difficult, both between the pandemic, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And, we've got a lot of other issues, economic hardships and mental health crises just in general going on. And, one of the kind of sad things is that we've not had a lot of new breakthroughs in terms of finding ways to treat things like opioid dependence. Medications like buprenorphine, can be helpful for some, but they're not always accessible. And, even for some people that they are accessible to, they may not want to go that route because they're not, interested in getting on an opioid agonist therapy. And so, I think it's really important that there be more research looking at these psychedelic treatments, specifically for opioid use disorder, which, there was a great early study published in 1973 that was done here in Baltimore, where 74 men who had a history of heroin dependence in the Baltimore area. But this is another place where there's a lot of opioid use, unfortunately. And half of them got a high dose LSD treatment. Half of them got basically released into the community, and they went on their way. And the people who got the LSD treatment over the year after that, were the ones who continued to maintain higher levels of abstinence from opioids. And so that was one of the kind of early studies that was published looking at using psychedelics for specifically treating opioid dependence. Since then, it really hasn't been well studied, meaning nobody's done like a clinical trial where, you're giving somebody a psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca, for instance, to deal with their opioid dependence. But that type of research is being planned and going to be taking place here at Hopkins and probably other labs too around the country. But I know certainly one of my colleagues, Dr. Sandeep Nayak, is working on a study that will start either later this year or early next year, where we'll be using psilocybin-assisted treatment for people and trying to get into recovery from opioids. And so I think that'll give us some more data in terms of how useful this could be. But there's been a lot of talk about this even just recently in the last few years. A couple of papers have been published where they take these sort of big national data sets, and they take these National Survey on Drug Use and Health data, where they get tens of thousands of people to fill these surveys out, and they talk about what their drug use has been like and their mental health has been like in the last year. And what's been interesting is that there's been associations found between people who use psychedelics, having a lower likelihood of becoming dependent on opioids. And so what that kind of suggests is that there is potentially a protective benefit of these psychedelics and the experiences that people have with them that would kind of steer you away from using or abusing opioids, which I think is, again, another good signal that this could be a really promising direction for treatment there.
No, I love it. And like, just to remind everybody, I was addicted to heroin. I was addicted to cocaine. I was an alcoholic. I smoked cigarettes. I was addicted to Xanax, food, scratch off tickets, women, you name it. I was addicted to it, anything to take myself out of the misery that I was living in every day. And it was as a direct result of these kind of, out of psychedelic medicines that I alleviated all of that out of my life. So like, I'm a huge fan of your work. I've been talking about this stuff for years now. And I remember when I first had these profound experiences that propelled me to start changing my life, I was telling everybody, like, hey, listen, I took 6 grams of mushrooms and I meditated on it in pitch black. And I went out into the universe and realized that, I was a part of consciousness, that we're all connected, and that, basically we're all lit. And when I came back down from that experience, I realized, it's like, as being an extension of the divine, I really needed to treat myself accordingly and start to take all of those things out of the equation. And without these compounds, I would have never accomplished that. But trying to tell people about that, they're like, he's crazy. It's like, wait a second, you're taking drugs to get off of drugs? And it's like, yeah, but these are different kind of drugs. This is completely different. Well, Joe Rogan talks about it. It's like, you got compounds like opiates or like, heroin or cocaine or whatever. And like, these drugs really aren't good for you. They're not benefiting you. But, then you have compounds like psychedelic medicines, which are tapping people into higher states of consciousness and actually doing, physiological healing to the neural pathways and all of this other amazing stuff. So, drugs is a big, broad label to just slap on all these different compounds.
Yeah. And there's been a big sea change, in terms of like even the last 10, 20 years, where I think at some point, people thought it was crazy to think about this as a potential treatment option. And nowadays, even the U.S. government is funding research to say, okay, let's look seriously at psychedelics as therapeutics. So, times are changing, but I agree, there's a lot of misgivings that people have. And sometimes there's a lot of misinformation that they've been fed about these drugs as being, these sort of really dangerous, risky things, which they, like all substances, they can be abused or, they can have some risks involved. However, they're really not this type of, drug that makes you go crazy, which I think is the sort of, common myth out there for a lot of people.
Yeah, it was a picture that was painted.
Yeah.
With your work at the National Institute for Drug Abuse and Intramural Neuroimaging, have you ever hooked anybody up to a monitor to see their brain activity during the use of psychedelics?
So actually, we have been looking specifically at our cigarette smokers before and after they quit. And so this for half of that group would include directly after or the day after they have a high dose psilocybin session. And really what we're looking at is sort of changes over time in the brain and the way that the brain is communicating. And so we haven't finished that study yet, and we haven't published those data. But yeah, we're not looking at people when they're when they're under the influence specifically. We're actually looking at if there's changes before and after the drug is administered, and if those changes have something to do with, for instance, recovery from addiction. That said, there have been a number of really good studies published where they're specifically looking at, what are people's brains doing when they are under the influence. And I'm not a brain scientist, so I'm not an expert to be able to give you like sort of the breakdown on that. But, the basics are, there are sort of hub regions or areas or what we call networks, I guess, in the brain. And that those networks are usually running in certain patterns. You can almost think of it like traffic patterns in the city. Certain times, certain roads are going to be really busy. Other times, those roads will be empty. What happens is the traffic patterns in your brain in terms of information flow are changing when people are under the influence. And all of a sudden, these roads that usually nobody's going on are packed with new information moving to and from different areas of the brain. And so when that's happening, people are also having, these subjective drug effects, which is, this feeling of ego dissolution or, these other perceptual changes or changes in thinking and emotion. So it really just sort of opens up a whole new level of brain dynamics that's not present when you're, basically on a placebo or when you're sober. And so that's, something that we're investigating as a potential mechanism for instance, for getting people out of these sort of repetitive loops that we can get stuck in. And that includes things like addictions, but also things like depression, where basically your brain is kind of constantly, staying with this negative thought patterns, thinking badly about ourselves, thinking badly about the world, or perseverating on, negative emotions. And so there's something about that very dynamic brain state that the drugs can induce that seems to help us kind of snap out of those stuck patterns that we get locked into.
Yeah. Super interesting.
For sure. Just to let you know, like here at Myself Wellness, we've been having phenomenal results with people that are suffering with substance abuse issues. We had a 20-year-old guy who had actually overdosed off fentanyl and, died momentarily, and then he was revived. And 4 days later, he was doing psychedelic ketamine therapy here at the facility. And since he's gone through his treatments, he quit using drugs. He got a gym membership. He's re-enrolled back in college. I have a friend of mine who I actually, before I got sober, used to hang out with, and I noticed he was still struggling about a year and a half ago. So I reached out to him. He was a guy like me who couldn't put more than 6 months of sobriety together. And he went through the treatments and, and he was an IV drug user. And after he went through the treatments, he was just like, I've gone to rehab like a dozen times. And he's like, that first treatment was more than I got through going to a 28-day stay. And he's been sober for over 16 months now.
Wow.
And even just for the people that I've been, I was in recovery in 12-step meetings for a lot of years. And I have a lot of friends that have long-term sobriety under their belts. And they're actually coming in and doing psychedelic therapy. And they're like, I'm working the program. I'm living by spiritual guidelines, and I'm still so depressed. And then they go through the treatments, and they're like, "This is the first time in a decade I've really been happy. Really not been white knuckling it through my days. It's like I was staying sober, but my quality of life wasn't there. And this actually gave me the quality of life back." So I don't even think that this is just going to be beneficial for people that are going through the active addictions and things to that effect. People that have been in recovery for a number of years, this is going to benefit a lot. I know Bill Wilson, who is the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, actually used LSD 20 years into his own recovery to work on his own depression, and actually had a spiritual experience off of belladonna extract, I believe, when he was in detox, where he saw visions of the future in a society of alcoholics helping each other stay sober. So, just for everybody out there to know, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous was actually into psychedelic medicines.
That's absolutely right. That's a great point, Charles. And there's a really good book called Distilled Spirits that talks about like the history of Bill Wilson and Gerald Hurd and Aldous Huxley and these guys who are, early 20th century thinkers who were very influential, who also were using psychedelics back in those days. And you're right, the white light experience that Bill Wilson, talked about and attributed his long-term sobriety to was something that was, done by a belladonna extract, a psychedelic type of treatment using this deliriant flower that works on the cholinergic system, but basically a hallucinogen. And, later he did do LSD, and he actually wanted to kind of bring that into the AA 12-step model because he thought it was such a powerful way to have a spiritual awakening, though, there's a very strong sort of bent in the 12-step programs towards, abstinent-only models, which, eventually that kept Bill Wilson from talking about LSD within the AA programs specifically. But, coming back to something else you were talking about, we've been talking about psilocybin and a little bit about LSD and these classic psychedelics, as we call them. But, there's been really good work. And first, in Russia, there's this fellow, Dr. Evgeny Krupitsky, who is using ketamine-assisted treatment, years ago. This was back when, when I was a kid, but he was doing this research early on, really showing benefits using ketamine-assisted treatment for treating alcoholism, and then also for people with opioid dependence. And, that work was kind of, it fell off, and nobody really revisited that until recently. But now all of a sudden you've seen some really good papers in the last couple of years where scientists in New York, Elias Dakwar, published great findings using ketamine-assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder and even for cocaine use disorder, which is something that we do not have any sort of medical treatments that seem to work for. And he's got great results using mindfulness, in combination with ketamine. And it's not just, Elias in New York, but there's another great paper published earlier this year. Celia Morgan, who's in the UK overseas, had another great paper looking at ketamine for alcohol use disorder, showing good results. And so, I think that there's a ton of potential there. And I'm glad that, people like y'all are able to, have this available for people who are either in recovery, like you said, early on or later on, or people, dealing with other issues like depression, because, clearly there's been a strong signal for antidepressant effects with ketamine treatment as well.
One thing that we're doing here, my friend that, put the 16 months together, we actually just last night, he went and looked at the space at a local church here, and bi-weekly in the upcoming, in 2 weeks, we're going to start it. We're actually putting together basically a spin-off of a 12-step group that is completely okay and open to talk about psychedelics. And I think that that's going to be huge because, what Christina was talking about is my best friend actually died about a week and a half ago. And he died of, going through things like that we were talking about. And the truth is that I was trying to get him in for treatments, but we didn't get him in time fast enough. And, people don't have to die at these rates anymore. I like all of these other psychedelic compounds that are going through. I can't wait for them to do it. But we have an FDA approved medication right now, which is ketamine, which is doing amazing things for people in this area and helping people put together long-term sobriety, because we're getting to the root issue and the root cause of why people are self-medicating to begin with. Whatever the substance or whatever you're self-medicating with, that's really just a symptom of the underlying issue, which is at hand, whether it be depression, anxiety, which all pretty much stems from trauma to begin with. So, I'm not even just a believer of that these medicines are going to transform the way that people are staying sober, but I'm actually a pretty big believer that it's actually going to transform the direction that humanity is headed in.
Yeah, I mean, that's really tough, man. I'm sorry to hear about your friend, because like you said, with those situations, there always is feeling of, gosh, could we have done more? I wish we could have acted sooner. But yeah, you're right. I think the fact is, there's a lot of people beating on our door to try to get into these psilocybin clinical trials. There's only a handful of them, where there's only so much room in these studies. And so it's unfortunate because we have to turn a lot of people away. But it's really important to note that, there are functioning and operational and completely legitimate ketamine clinics out there where people can go to get medically supervised ketamine treatment that I think will operate as a way to help get a lot of folks, on the path of recovery, whether they're dealing with addictions or, like I said, mood issues, et cetera. So yeah, I think the work that's happening now with ketamine is really an important part of this, because also sort of building a initial platform where soon you're going to see not just ketamine treatments, but then also MDMA treatments and also psilocybin treatments. And so having those types of clinics that are already out there and they're able to do this type of work and they have people trained to do that, because, let's face it, this is a very different model of medicine, because it also includes having a profound altered state of consciousness, which you're not normally doing, in a regular medical treatment. And so that requires a whole different, setup and, clinical infrastructure and training. And so I think it's really good that is kind of getting out there already, and that it's, something that people have access to now.
Yeah. And that was one of our big proponents too, is that, ketamine therapy isn't the cheapest therapy out there. It's not really covered by insurance. So that was one of our biggest proponents for setting up the Warriors of Consciousness, because Charles does our sales, and he was tired of turning people down because they just couldn't afford the treatment. And so we're just really out here trying to make a better way for people to get help and access.
Yeah, it's like, when we're all connected. I mean, I know it's hard to believe for a lot of people, but at the end of the day, there really is this oneness with one consciousness. And, the guy who's holding up a sign on the side of the street looking for his next meal, if he needs ketamine therapy and is open to doing that and wanting to change his life, he needs access to this medicine just as much as the soccer mom that can afford the $3,000 treatments.
Yeah.
And that being said, I have a question to follow all this up with. Any foresight into the future with psilocybin and when you might think that it could possibly end up going through FDA approval?
Yeah. So right now, I would say MDMA is sort of getting to that stage of FDA approval. Probably in the next 1 to 2 years, you'll be getting to that place of seeing it get FDA approval and then go out into the world in terms of being available in clinics. I think psilocybin is just a little bit behind, so maybe 2 to 3 years. And mainly, a lot of that is just a function of being able to finish a lot of the research that needs to happen to get that FDA approval. And those are big studies, usually a couple hundred people. They take a long time because you're not only giving people the drug, but, you're following up with them 6 months, 12 months later to see how they're doing. So it takes a long time. It's a big operation. It's expensive. But all of that work is underway now. Amazing. And so, if all of the data that come back from these studies continue to look the way that they have been in terms of the studies that we know that we have available now, my guess is we will see a sort of legal psilocybin treatment, not just in Oregon or, one specific area, but something that's available throughout the 50 states, in the United States, and then probably in lots of other parts of the world as well, hopefully. One point that you mentioned that I think is really important is that, we have a for-profit healthcare system that doesn't work great. And so it also means that if you can't afford a medicine that's going to be life-saving for you, too bad. And if your insurance doesn't cover it, or if you don't have insurance, too bad, which is I think, a bit of a problem. But we need to figure out ways, to make this stuff accessible to people, and, regardless of where their income, looks like, or, what their insurance status is, because I agree with you that, this can really be an important way for a lot of people to sort of move in the direction of better health and wellness.
For sure, man.
Yeah.
For sure.
I want to thank you for taking the time to journey with us on this podcast today. It's been so insightful and a breath of differentness.
I loved it. Thank you so much again for the work that you're doing, your service to humanity. I loved having this conversation with you, and I'd love to have you back on in the future.
Yeah, definitely keep in touch. I will be in touch when I come down to Florida as well. But yeah, it's really great chatting with you all, hearing about, your story, but also just, hearing about the work that you're doing, because I'm excited about what this is going to look like, over the next few years.
For sure.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining with us today on this edition of Psychedelic Radio. You can download our past episodes of our program by going to cannabisradio.com or by subscribing to our show on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. To learn more about the Warriors of Consciousness, please follow us on social media or go to wocfund.org and watch the videos. And if nobody's told you that they love you lately, we do.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.